Greetings. My name is Irfan Nuruddin. I'm the director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., and professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Over the past year and a half, we have been focused on the peace process in Afghanistan. And then as circumstances in 2021 changed, with increasing concern, beginning to consider the implications of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Yet, in spite of all of that work, none of us could have seen coming the events of the past week. The rapid rise to power of the Taliban, the collapse of the Afghan National Security Forces and of the central government, and the desperate scenes currently unfolding in Kabul at Hamid Karzai International Airport, as thousands of Afghans vulnerable to recrimination and repercussion from the Taliban seek to evacuate their country. Throughout the rest of the country, other scenes are unfolding as people grapple with this new reality. Lots of focus in conversations about the implications of this for US credibility on the international stage, for the future of the democracy, human rights agenda that President Biden has articulated, but maybe most pertinently and most immediately, the consequences for women and girls, for civil society activists, and for journalists in Afghanistan. Today, we are very honored to have Mr. Jamie Fly, President of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, join us. Mr. Fly oversees the largest independent news operation in Afghanistan, and he joins me today to talk about his analysis of what we should expect in the media landscape, how his organization will continue to provide coverage of events in Afghanistan, and what the international community might do to support efforts like his to make sure that there is a free and vibrant media landscape in Afghanistan. Without further ado, welcome, Jamie.
Great to be with you, Irfan.
Thank you. If one cannot underscore how sad the situation is right now, but you have been dealing with it in a way that very few other people have direct experience. You have such a tremendous network of journalists on the ground, both in Afghanistan and in the region. And of course, while Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is well known to many, it might not be perfectly well known to everyone who's listening to this. So maybe you can take a few minutes just to acquaint our listeners with both what your organization does, its history in Afghanistan, and what the immediate situation on the ground is for your journalists.
Sure. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is headquartered in Prague in the Czech Republic, but we're a multimedia news organization funded by the US Congress through an annual appropriation. Although we receive our funding from the US Congress on an annual basis, we are editorially independent by statute of the United States government. And the reason that US taxpayers fund us on an annual basis is to provide objective news and information in societies, in markets where it otherwise does not exist. And so this ranges from countries where freedom of the press, that might be democracies, but where freedom of the press is under assault, to outright authoritarian regimes where other than our reporting, there really are only one or sometimes two options for people when they want to learn about what is going on in their societies and in their countries' politics. We cover 23 countries in 27 languages across Eurasia, stretching essentially from Belarus all the way to Afghanistan. Our Afghan service, Radio Azadi, has been operating now in its latest incarnation for almost 20 years. And we've operated with an extensive network of journalists on the ground, based out of a bureau in Kabul, as well as reporting from almost all of the provinces of Afghanistan, and then also supplemented by some Afghan staff working out of our headquarters here in Prague. And Azadi, like the entire company, has been a trusted source of news and information for the Afghan people with extensive audience reach. When I look at all of our markets, to be honest, Afghanistan may be the market where we have the greatest reach. The latest survey from several years ago found that we reached perhaps 46% of Afghans on a weekly basis, which in this modern media landscape in most countries is incredibly difficult to replicate.
So that's a remarkable record of service to the Afghan people, but also to the broader society that is curious for news and accurate, independent news on Afghanistan. Maybe before we get really into sort of that aspect of your work, would you want to take us really just to share our views as to what is being done right now to protect that vast network on the ground? I imagine a lot of them have been in pretty desperate situations in the immediate last 10 days.
Yes, and certainly the situation right now is deeply troubling in Kabul and elsewhere in the country. But our journalists have been on the front lines for many years, targeted by the Taliban, targeted by other extremist groups for their objective and independent journalism. Those who traditionally, prior to the collapse of the Afghan government, those who often were at the greatest risk were our journalists out beyond Kabul in the provinces where they were much more exposed, where they were often the only journalist in a particular region, so they were easily identifiable. And so we've had significant security challenges for many years in Afghanistan. We've sadly lost 4 of our colleagues over the last 4 years, 3 in a suicide bombing in Kabul near our bureau. And then most recently, last November, one of our Helmand correspondents was actually assassinated in Lashkar Gah. We don't know for sure which group, but either the Taliban or by an affiliated group targeted him specifically. In the months leading up to the collapse of the government, we noticed a steady increase in threats against our journalists. We were not alone in this. This was widely documented by many news organizations inside Afghanistan. There were several Afghan news organizations that suffered assassinations of journalists, including female journalists. And we knew that the Taliban and other groups were being very methodical in their targeting of journalists, issuing written threats in some cases, online threats in others. And as their Taliban forces advanced across Afghanistan, we began to take action to relocate our staff in the provinces to safety to ensure that they could be protected. So we've already been in recent months in a constant struggle to protect our journalists. And this latest quick collapse of the government in Kabul has just made that situation much worse. I don't really want to get into details about our current presence on the ground. I'll just say that ever since the events of this last weekend, we have been working around the clock with a variety of governments, not just the US government, but European governments as well, to explore all potential ways to bring any of our journalists who want to leave Afghanistan to safety. As we've seen, though, in recent days, it is incredibly difficult for many vulnerable Afghans right now to get out of the country. And that's not because of a lack of seats on planes, unfortunately. The biggest challenge for many is access to the airport. And that has been documented by a number of Western journalists who have been reporting from the airport. And all one needs to do is look on social media for the many personal accounts of Afghans who have spent hours trying to get into the airport to safety. And so that is our biggest concern. We're working with all partners we can find to try to resolve that issue. But I'm confident once the situation at the airport improves, that a lot of these broader concerns that Afghan journalists and other vulnerable Afghan communities have about their future can hopefully be addressed, and as many people as possible can be evacuated.
Well, we wish you and your colleagues utmost luck and hope that the entire situation at the airport resolves amicably and quickly, because this is an embarrassment for lots of different actors that we don't need to get into. If we roll the clock back a few months, right, as you point out, and maybe ignored by a lot of other outside viewers, the situation had already begun to deteriorate for journalists on the ground. But let's go back a few months nonetheless, and have you tell us what your assessment of the media landscape in Afghanistan had become. In a sense, what do we stand to lose now based on how far we had gotten, let's say, at the start of 2021?
Yeah, I mean, the sad thing about where we might go if the Taliban start to exert more controls on freedom of expression, more controls on the platforms that news organizations use to reach their audiences, is I think our experience has been that Afghanistan has had a fairly vibrant media landscape. There are private news organizations that are always competing and jostling for stories and leads, access to political figures. And Afghans in recent years have been able to access that content on a wide range of platforms, even online. A lot of our audience engages with our content through radio, but we also have an extensive presence online. There are TV stations that have been quite active, as we've seen some of the reporting from Tolo News this week. And so it's not a market compared to some in which we operate, where there is only one alternative to independent outlets like ours, and that's state propaganda. It actually was a market that had some diversity. And while it always, I think, could be improved with more competition, more players on the market, it was by far not the least free market in which we operate. And so I think that will be incredibly concerning if the Taliban decide to target that space for free expression. Because I think Afghans, from our experience, as they interact with our content, as they call into our call-in shows, as they discuss a wide range of issues, not just politics, but cultural issues, social issues, I think Afghans, especially younger Afghans, have become used to that. I mean, this is not the Afghanistan of the 1990s. They expect the ability to interact and engage with each other and to receive independent information. And so I think that would be a horrible thing to lose if we begin to see the Taliban impose more controls on the Afghan media space.
Yeah, and if anything, it really is a testament to the great work you and many others in the space have done, which is that the Taliban faces a very different society than the one that they might remember ruling in the mid-1990s. This is a society that has gotten much more accustomed to a set of freedoms, and regardless of the force the Taliban will undoubtedly exercise, taking freedoms away from people is a very difficult thing, and the demand for liberty continues. You've, as you've pointed out repeatedly, have tremendous experience as an organization working in even more difficult situations than Afghanistan. And that means you're well equipped to begin to think of contingency plans for the future, right? If the Taliban allows some operation, you have a plan. If the Taliban really cramps down, undoubtedly you have a plan as well. So without getting into any detail that would endanger anyone on the ground, what are the best practices for making sure that news continues to get out, that the world knows what's happening, that Afghans know what's happening, even if the Taliban chooses to crack down pretty extensively on the media? How do you operate in such a space?
Yeah, that's an important question right now. And it's a question that we're not just facing, unfortunately, in Afghanistan. In recent months, the company has gone through significant challenges in several other markets, most notably Russia and Belarus, where our physical presence in each of those countries has been under pressure, and where we face, in the longer term, the potential for our journalistic network to be compromised in perhaps some of the ways that it could be down the road in Afghanistan. And so I think the way that we are looking at it is, in the modern age, it opens up some options and some tools which perhaps did not exist decades prior. We as a company during our Cold War history actually usually operated from afar. Prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, we did not have bureaus in the countries we served. And so some of this for us is going back to our Cold War roots of having passionate advocates for a particular country operate physically out of that country, but these are people who know their country well, they know their audience well, and they have contacts still in country, sharing information with them on a regular basis about what is going on, about the issues that the audience would want to engage with. And in the age of social media, as long as internet access remains available, or cell phones remain available, or even satellite phones remain available, it's very difficult for authoritarians of any stripe to completely cut off their country from the outside world and prevent all of their citizens from sharing information with those on the outside, including news organizations. So what we've done in a number of other markets is you can rely on user-generated content. You can actually engage your audience in new ways, actually draw them into your reporting, which also then has to be verified and fact-checked. But there are ways that you can actually make the experience that people have more immersive with your content. And so those are some of the things that we may need to turn to if we have the worst case scenario that you mentioned of very little ability to have a journalistic network on the ground.
The fragmentation and these new technologies are, as you point out, a tremendous asset, right? We've seen it in Hong Kong, we've seen it in China, we've definitely seen it in Russia, where, as you point out, user-generated content is virtually impossible to suppress completely. You can make life very difficult, and undoubtedly lots of people suffer consequences for their bravery. And yet, again, people find a way to get the news out. But the flip side of that a lot of folks are worried about is, and the Taliban seems to have been a particularly successful user of this, is misinformation, disinformation, psychological operations, partly because the standards that you just espoused, verification, identification, aren't required by a lot of the platforms that now people have access to. So both, I think, in the general, but also maybe in the specific case of Afghanistan, what is your organization doing to counter the barrage of misinformation that is pumped out by ostensibly legitimate outlets, at least from the outside view, and especially in societies where maybe people don't have as much sophistication or as much experience so that they can distinguish between what is a credible news source and what might be less credible?
It's an important question because across our markets, and we've noticed this also in Afghanistan, we've seen groups like the Taliban or authoritarian governments harness social media to advance their agenda. And it's very different, I think, from some of the things we saw regimes traditionally do of just putting out an official state line where they're trying to advance their own official narrative. They do some of that using social media, but more often than not, it's spreading conspiracy theories, undermining confidence in their perceived opponents, attacking journalists. We've seen brutal use of social media by the Taliban to target journalists online, especially female journalists, including some of our journalists, to even people who did not live in Afghanistan, but who worked for us and would occasionally post information online, being attacked personally and in threatening ways, espousing violence. We've seen the Taliban use all of these tools online against journalists, in part to rally their supporters, but then also obviously to instill fear in those that they want to oppose. So it's a significant challenge. We have a number of things we do across RFERL's coverage area to combat disinformation, certain types of TV programming, certain types of fact checking that we do. But what we try to focus on is the best way to counter disinformation is not always chasing after that malign narrative and trying to make sure that people who saw the conspiracy theory realize that it was false. The best way to counter misinformation and disinformation is to put out the facts. And so that's where our journalists are essential, because if they are on the ground, if they have networks inside the country that can verify whether something that the Taliban or other extremist groups are putting out online, they can verify that that's false. They can put out the facts about what's happening on the ground or what's happening with a particular policy. That is incredibly powerful. The other thing that we do through Radio Azadi, which we don't do in all of our language services, is we actually allow the audience to interact with our presenters. So we have radio call-in shows where people can come on air and have debates. So it's not just putting out a particular fact in response to misinformation, but people can actually do that in real time, can call in, ask questions, ask if they've heard something from another source, whether that's true, and interact sometimes with fellow audience members, but then also with our journalists who host those shows. And so through programs like that, I think ultimately we can have a powerful impact in responding to the sort of narratives that the Taliban are always pushing on the Afghan people.
Thank you. The radio part of this, I have to say, as a radio junkie myself, is particularly fascinating. I grew up in India, and some of my earliest and fondest memories were, using the transistor radio to catch the signal for BBC World Service and having that beamed in. And yet, for many people, I imagine radio feels quaint, old-fashioned, etc. Can you talk about why the investment in radio, what role radio plays? You mentioned at the top of our conversation that 46% of Afghans are reached by the work that you and your colleagues do through Radio Azadi. Why is radio still so critical for the US government and US taxpayers to be investing in, even in the age of social media and smartphones and everything else?
Yeah, it's an important question. I mean, for us, some of the reason that we in certain markets have been very focused on radio just goes back to our history. I mean, we started off as a radio company for the first several decades of our existence. And so that is in our DNA. In Afghanistan, and I will say that is changing substantially across most of our markets. Very few of our markets see radio as a viable long-term platform for reaching the audience. And if in the regular surveys that we have access to, it is very apparent that even TV is on the decline in most Western markets or markets in the former Soviet Union. Everyone is moving online to get their news and information. It's not even just an issue related to age groups. Even older individuals in those countries are going online using social media to get news and information. There are some countries, though, because of geography, because of tradition, and I think Afghanistan falls into that category where radio is just a much easier platform to access a wide swath of the Afghan public. There's less of an urban-rural divide if you're engaging people on radio than if you focused on satellite or digital. Not to say the internet only exists in Kabul. But it's a platform that you can use in remote rural areas. In some families, it's part of a tradition of at different times of day, different family members of different genders having access to the radio for certain types of programming. And so it's useful from that perspective. But we have seen, obviously, social media use increase in Afghanistan up until now. And so we have invested in that as a platform as well. I think the final thing I'd say is the big question is what the Taliban try to do with those fundamental questions about which platforms will be allowed, whether they'll ban certain types of not just content, but transmission. Will they push their own content onto existing platforms and insist that radio transmitters only air certain programs or only programs that do not include female voices, for instance, or do not include music? It's very early, but we've seen some troubling signs in some of the provinces that they have taken over where local Taliban have tried to impose controls on transmission of certain types of content. But we will be prepared no matter what the actions the Taliban take to control the means of access to the Afghan audience. And we'll have to be creative about our solutions to ensure that we can continue to share our content with that audience.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much both for taking the time to talk with me and to share your perspective and analysis, your vast experience with those who will watch this webinar. But also really on behalf of your colleagues, please accept our gratitude for the incredible bravery each of them shows in doing the work they do. I'm reminded of the fact that we know how bad the Taliban was in the 1990s is because of the brave work done by so many journalists on the ground who got the stories of the atrocities being committed out. And no doubt they are the same individuals who worked in post-Taliban Afghanistan to share stories about the excesses of American troops, of NATO troops, of the Afghan forces, of corruption in government, and of course of the good news that emerged in so many parts of that country as people enjoyed new freedoms. And undoubtedly, even under difficult circumstances, they will continue to do that work in the months and years to come. So please accept very much our deepest concern for your colleagues. We hope every one of them reaches safety along with their families. And thank you so much. I hope to keep this conversation going.
Thanks so much, Irfan. Great to be with you.